Halbig was a live torpedo in the water for Obamacare, and that torpedo just hit. What this decision could allow is a virtual exodus from the law. It would allow people to constructively create an exemption from the individual mandate.
Congress intended for every eligible American to have access to tax credits that would lower their health care costs, regardless of whether it was state officials or federal officials who were running the marketplace. I think that is a pretty clear intent of the congressional law. We are confident in the legal case that the Department of Justice will be making. While this ruling is interesting to legal theorists, it has no practical impact on their tax credits right now.
Two federal courts making two very different decisions on one issue, Obamacare and the IRS rule about subsidies and whether the federal government can issue subsidies in exchanges that they're running, not run by the states. It affects 36 states. Let's bring in our panel. Ron Fournier, senior political columnist of the National Journal. Kirsten Powers, USA Today columnist and syndicated columnist. Charles Krauthammer. Okay, Ron, obviously a big day in the courts. Impact overall, do you think?
Well, short term, none, because the Supreme Court is probably going to have to sort this out, and they probably will in the next couple of years. The question is, what was Congress's intent? That's kind of ambiguous. I think the administration has a relatively low bar to overcome before the Supreme Court. I wouldn't be surprised to see this split pretty much along the lines as it did a couple of years ago. The big issue here is this is another example where Congress isn't functioning well. It's not clear what their intent was. The administration's not working well with Congress, so the courts are playing a more active role in basically legislating 1/5 of our economy.
Kirsten.
Well, I think what's interesting is that both courts, though they ruled differently, agreed on one thing, which is that the language is very ambiguous. It's just that one court said we're going to defer to the IRS, the other court said no. There was a dissenting opinion also, of course, that making the argument that this was crystal clear, that it should be obvious if you look at the entire scope of the law, what the administration intended. But I think if you have two courts both saying this is very ambiguous language, then it points to a problem with the bill. Right, that they weren't clear enough in what the actual intent here was.
Here's two lawmakers, including the Senate Majority Leader, weighing in.
Two activist Republican judges sought to undermine a law that was passed in Congress by Congress, upheld by the Supreme Court, is now benefiting millions of Americans.
I call on the Supreme Court to take up this case about the issue of subsidies and finally come to a conclusion on this so people understand what is in the law.
So two very different views. Charles, the court that found the plain language in the law to be, that's the D.C. Circuit Court, said it was unambiguously restricts the subsidy to insurance purchased on exchanges established by the state.
And that's the whole point. The two courts did not agree that this is ambiguous. One court said it was ambiguous, and thus we will defer to the IRS. The other court said it's not ambiguous. You read the language, it says the subsidies will be available for people who get their insurance through the state exchanges. That's not ambiguous at all. The claim of the government is, well, it was a drafting error, and what we really intended was it should be for everyone. Well, Annie McCarthy, among others, pointed out, even if you accept the defense of the government that it is a drafting error in a bill is still part of the bill, and the only instrument in the constitutional system we have that can change an error, drafting or otherwise, is the Congress. It is not the purview, it is not in the power of the executive to fix what's written in the legislation. That's the issue at hand. Of course, the issue in the end, the effect will be on whether Obamacare lives or dies, because if the D.C. court is upheld, Obamacare is over, it won't survive. But the constitutional issue is who gets to decide what a plain, unambiguous statement is in a bill. It has to be Congress, otherwise it overturns our system of checks and balances.
You do have an amazing collision between the IRS and Obamacare that is a perfect storm for people who are opposed to President Obama.
So let's just talk quickly about the politics here leading up to November, how it plays as you wait for these midterms. Increasingly, I mean, you see polls that are upside down from the administration point of view about the status of Obamacare in these state races.
Yeah, I think two things. One, and I think you would agree with this, the folks on the conservatives who are opposed to President Obama and think he's been overreaching too far, this just adds fuel to the fire and gets them much more energized. I don't see how this cuts in any way in the favor of the president. They were hoping that this would help get out their base, that people would feel like ObamaCare is, which is very important to some minority communities. But I think this hurts the president much more than helps him.
Agree?
I don't know, because I also think I see that, but then I also could see this being almost like the Hobby Lobby decision, where it's something that gets everybody ginned up, feeling that the court is out to get the administration, the court is ruling unfairly. I think if the court that ruled against this really believes that this is unambiguous, that's concerning to me, because this is extremely ambiguous language, and if they're claiming that it's not, rather than saying we're going to kind of rule, we're going to look at this and we're going to rule in one way, that would seem a little more fair. If they're actually going to seriously say this isn't ambiguous, then I'm going to start to maybe side with Harry Reid that maybe this is a little activist, because I think it's not clear. If you look at the language, I can see how a court would go in both directions.
I agree. It's hard to tell the intent, don't you think, Charles? It's really hard to tell what their intent is on whether these subsidies could be used.
We are not conjuring up intent out of thin air. When you're interpreting a law, you start with the language. If the language is plain, it says you get a subsidy if you sign up with a state entity, with a state exchange. That's clear. The intent, well, perhaps they made a mistake. We actually know the intent. Even I believe it wasn't a mistake. I believe it was a deliberate thing that the Democrats put in the law as a way to create a carrot and stick to force states to go in and establish exchanges. The idea was that if you told a state, if you don't establish an exchange, you won't get a subsidy, all the states will rally and it'll all get done. Well, they underestimated the amount of resistance, the amount of unhappiness with the law, and they ended up...
Well, in fact, 86% of those in the federal exchanges get subsidies.
Yes, but they are supposed to consider the intent. I don't know why you're saying they're not. I mean, the court does consider the intent of Congress. I mean, you can't just say we're just going to play this game and look at this sentence here and ignore everything around it. Yes. That's not what the court does.
Yes. We're going to ignore the plain statement of a sentence.
But in the full context, I think it reads very differently.
It was clear that Democrats were trying to create conditions and incentives for states to establish an exchange, and to do so they thought they would be okay in creating a condition that you could only have a subsidy if a state created an exchange, and it turned out against them, and now they're whining about it because it didn't work out.
The law, this is going to go to the Supreme Court. It's going to go to the Supreme Court. It's going to take a long time to adjudicate this, because it's going to just take a long time to get through all the courts. That said, the politics we just talked about, the newest poll about Obamacare is, as we said, 43% approve it, 55% against it. It's a Quinnipiac poll, and we saw it just briefly there. We'd like to see it a little bit longer, and, you know, it doesn't seem like it's going well across the country.
I don't think this ruling is going to have an effect one way or the other on those numbers, and it certainly will not have an effect on the midterm elections, because it'll go to the Supreme Court for sure, and that's not going to happen at least until next year. It could have an impact in 2016, because if it's delayed till 2016 and comes down on, you know, June the 30th, 2016, in the middle of a presidential election, and it goes one way, that's the end of Obamacare, and that's going to be a bomb going off in the middle of a presidential election.